The damp basement air smelled of rot and old secrets as the crowbar bit into the wood. When the paneling finally splintered, it didn't reveal a pipe leak or a structural flaw, but a bundle wrapped in oil-stained burlap that felt unnervingly heavy in Maggie's trembling hands. As she brushed away decades of dust, the first line of the hidden diary didn't just tell a story. It shattered the memory of the man the entire town had built a statue for in the square. Upstairs, the floorboards groaned under the heavy, polished tread of her brother, the man whose face was currently plastered on every campaign billboard in the county. He didn't knock. He simply stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light, watching her clutch the yellowed pages to her chest. "Some things are better left buried in the dark, Maggie," he whispered, his voice carrying the same terrifying low hum that used to precede the storms of their childhood. Outside, the fog rolled off the Kentucky mountains like a shroud, and Maggie realized that the walls of her family home weren't there to keep the world out. They were built to keep the truth from ever getting away. The bell above the door jingled, once, twice, before the hinges groaned shut behind him. Maggie's fingers twitched around the chipped mug, steam curling into the stale air of the diner. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but she didn't drink it. She watched the man slide into the booth across from her, his boots leaving damp prints on the linoleum. Rainwater beaded on the shoulders of his jacket, darkening the fabric in uneven patches. He smelled of wet wool and motor oil, the scent clinging to the back of her throat. "You're late," she said. He didn't apologize. Instead, he dragged a napkin across his face, leaving streaks of grime on the paper. "Traffic on 65, semi-jackknifed near the exit." His voice was rough, like gravel under tires. "You order?" She shook her head. The menu lay untouched between them, its laminated edges peeling. Outside, headlights cut through the downpour, casting flickering shadows across the table. A trucker at the counter laughed too loud, the sound sharp as broken glass. His thumb traced the rim of her mug. "You look like hell." Maggie exhaled through her nose. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, a steady, irritating hum. She wanted to tell him about the eviction notice taped to her door, about the way her landlord's breath had reeked of whiskey when he'd knocked at dawn. But the words stuck, heavy as the weight in her chest. Instead, she pushed the mug toward him. "Drink it. It's bitter, but it's warm. I have to go to work." The man, a local contractor who never seemed to finish a job, merely grunted, but Maggie was already sliding out of the booth. The diner felt small, the air thick with the smell of old grease and the unspoken failures of everyone inside. She stepped out into the biting Kentucky air, where the mist clung to the Appalachian peaks like a shroud. These mountains used to represent home, but lately they felt like the bars of a cage, rising high and jagged against a sky the color of a bruised plum. At the elementary school, the atmosphere offered no reprieve. Maggie stood at the chalkboard, the white dust of the chalk coating her fingers and settling into the creases of her palms. She traced the dates of the American Revolution, her handwriting small and cramped, reflecting the tightening in her own throat. Behind her, the rhythmic scratching of pencils and the occasional cough of a child filled the room. The children looked bored, their faces pale under the flickering fluorescent tubes. Outside, the landscape of eastern Kentucky stretched out in a weary expanse of brown hills and rusting barn roofs. The air in the classroom felt heavy, stagnant, as if the very breath of the students were turning into a thick, invisible fog that pressed against the windows. Maggie gripped the chalk until it snapped. She stared at the broken piece in her hand, the white dust staining her navy sleeve. The school day ended with a hollow ring of the bell, a sound that usually brought relief, but today only heralded the return to a house that had become a mausoleum of silence. Maggie drove home, the tires of her old sedan crunching over the gravel driveway of the Calloway estate. The house sat on the edge of town, a two-story brick structure that seemed to be sinking into the damp earth. She turned the key in the heavy oak lock, the mechanism groaning in protest. Inside, the air smelled of stale cedar and old wax, a scent that always triggered a phantom ache in her shoulders. She had been trying to fix the leaks in the basement for weeks, a task her father would have handled with a terrifying efficiency. Now, it fell to her. She descended the narrow stairs, the wood screaming under her weight. The basement was a labyrinth of forgotten things, broken chairs, water-damaged trunks, and the skeletal remains of a life her mother had tried to piece together. Lighting a single bare bulb, Maggie grabbed a rusted crowbar. She needed to get behind the rotted paneling near the furnace where the dampness was worst. The metal bit into the soft, decaying wood. With a sharp grunt, Maggie pried the board away. The sound of splintering timber echoed through the concrete space, a violent intrusion into the stillness. She tore at the panels, her breath coming in ragged gasps, driven by a sudden, inexplicable need to strip this house to its bones. She wanted to find the source of the rot, not just in the walls, but in the very foundation of her existence. The crowbar slipped, wedging into a hollow space behind a false stud. Maggie paused, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pulled again, and a section of the wall gave way, collapsing onto the floor in a cloud of gray dust. In the dark cavity lay a bundle wrapped in coarse, oil-stained burlap. Her hands shook as she reached for it. Inside were 3 journals, their imitation leather covers peeling, the edges of the pages yellowed like old teeth. She opened the first one. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her mother's elegant, flowing script, now appearing like a ghost on the page. He came to the room again tonight. The first line read, "The judge says it is for my own good, that the bruises are the price of a righteous home." Maggie sank to the cold concrete floor, the dampness seeping through her jeans. She read through the accounts of her father's discipline, the way he used his status as the town's most respected judge to mask the systematic destruction of his wife. The words were sharp, jagged shards of a reality Maggie had spent 30 years trying to forget. She remembered the silence of the house, the way her mother would wear long sleeves even in the height of summer, the way her father's voice would drop to a low, terrifying hum before the storm broke. The shadows in the basement seemed to lengthen, creeping toward her like ink spilled on a map. She clutched the journals to her chest, the smell of old ink and sorrow filling her lungs. Her father, the man the town had built a statue for in the square, was a monster. And she had stood by, a silent witness in pigtails, listening to the muffled thuds from behind the bedroom door. The next morning found her at the town cemetery. The rain had turned to a fine, persistent drizzle that blurred the names on the headstones. Maggie knelt before her mother's grave, the granite cold and indifferent. She touched the name Evelyn Calloway, the letters filled with moss. "I'm sorry," Maggie whispered, her voice a thin thread in the wind. "I didn't say anything. I just watched." She felt the weight of the journals in her bag, a physical burden that seemed to pull her toward the earth. The guilt was a leaden cloak, pinning her to the mud. She stayed there until her legs went numb, watching the gray clouds churn over the mountains. The peace she had sought by ignoring the past was gone, replaced by a jagged, burning need for a truth that could no longer be contained. The silence of the graveyard was shattered by the roar of a powerful engine. A black, polished SUV tore down the narrow access road, throwing gravel against the iron fence. Maggie stood, wiping the mud from her coat as the vehicle came to a halt. The door opened, and Silas stepped out. Her brother looked like a man who had never known a day of labor in his life. His suit was a charcoal wool that probably cost more than Maggie's annual salary. He adjusted his silk tie, his face breaking into that practiced, charismatic smile that had already won over half the voters in the district. Behind him, a few local reporters scrambled out of a second car, their cameras clicking as Silas walked toward the Calloway plot. He was here for a photo op. The grieving son, the rising political star, paying respects to the family legacy. "Maggie," he said, his voice a rich baritone that commanded the air around him. He didn't look at her. He looked at the cameras. He leaned down and placed a wreath of lilies on their father's grave, which sat adjacent to their mother's. "The people need to see that we remember where we came from." Maggie watched him, her stomach churning. He looked so much like their father, it made her skin crawl. The same broad shoulders, the same way he held his head, as if the world were a courtroom and he was the only one allowed to speak. "They need to see the truth, Silas," she said quietly. He finally turned to her, his eyes narrowing. The cameras were far enough away that his expression remained a mask of brotherly concern, but the warmth didn't reach his gray eyes. "Not today, Maggie. We have a schedule." He brushed past her, the scent of expensive cologne and success trailing in his wake. Maggie stood in the rain, watching him shake hands with a local councilman, the journals in her bag feeling like a ticking bomb. That evening, the storm finally broke. Lightning flickered over the ridges, illuminating the peeling wallpaper of the Calloway living room. Silas sat in their father's old wingback chair, in his legs crossed, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand. He looked perfectly at home, while Maggie felt like a trespasser. She walked to the coffee table and placed the journals down between them. The thud they made was small, but in the silence of the house, it sounded like a gavel falling. "I found these in the basement," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts. "Behind the paneling, Mom's journals." Silas didn't move. He stared at the peeling leather covers for a long moment before reaching out. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the descriptions of the judge's late-night visitations, the threats, the systematic breaking of a woman's spirit. Maggie waited for the crack in his armor, for the brother who used to hide with her in the closet to reappear. Instead, Silas closed the book with a sharp snap. He set his whiskey down on the table, the glass clinking against the wood. "This is garbage, Maggie," he said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous register their father had used. "The ramblings of a woman who lost her mind toward the end. You know she was on pills. She was on pills because he broke her, Silas. Read what he did to her. Read what he did to you." Silas stood up, his height suddenly oppressive in the small room. He stepped toward her, and Maggie instinctively backed away, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. "Our father was a great man," Silas hissed. "He built this town. He built our future. I am 3 weeks away from a seat in the Senate, and I will not have you dragging up the delusions of a dead woman to ruin it." "It's not a delusion. I saw it. You saw it." Silas reached out, his hand flashing through the air to grab the journals. Maggie lunged for them first, clutching the bundle to her chest. She scrambled back, knocking over a floor lamp that shattered against the hardwood. The room plunged into partial shadow, the only light coming from the hallway. "Give them to me," Silas commanded. He moved with a terrifying, calculated speed. He caught her in the corner by the buffet, his fingers digging into her forearms with a strength that made her cry out. He smelled of whiskey and old, inherited rage. Maggie twisted, her glasses sliding down her nose. She managed to shove the journals into the narrow gap beneath the heavy oak buffet, the wood scraping her knuckles. Silas growled, a sound that wasn't human, and his fist slammed into the wall inches from her ear. Plaster dust rained down on her hair. He pulled back, breathing hard, his face a mask of primal fury. For a second, the mask slipped entirely, and Maggie saw the ghost of the judge staring back at her. "You have until dawn," Silas said, his voice now deathly calm, which was worse than the shouting. He straightened his tie, his hand steady. "You burn those books, or you'll find out exactly how much influence I have in this county. You'll lose the school. You'll lose this house. I'll have you committed before the sun sets tomorrow. Do you understand me?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned on his heel and walked out, the front door slamming with a force that rattled the windows in their frames. Maggie collapsed against the wall, her breath coming in short, jagged hitches. She reached under the buffet and pulled the journals back out, her fingers tracing the indentations Silas's grip had left on her skin. She retreated to her bedroom, dragging a heavy chest of drawers across the door. It was a futile gesture, but it was the only defense she had. She sat on her bed, the journals spread out under the glow of a small lamp. She flipped to the back of the second volume, searching for something she had missed. There, in a section she had skipped in her initial shock, she found it. "Silas is becoming like him," her mother had written. "I found him in the barn yesterday with the neighbor's dog. When I tried to stop him, he looked at me with James's eyes. He didn't say a word. He just smiled. I am failing them both. God forgive me, I am raising a monster." Maggie closed her eyes, the tears finally coming. It wasn't just the past she was fighting. It was a cycle that had already claimed her brother. The rot hadn't stayed in the basement. It had moved into the light, dressed in a suit and tie, seeking a seat of power. The next few days were a blur of escalating pressure. At the school, Maggie felt the shift in the air before she saw the consequences. The principal, a man who had always been a friend of the Calloway family, wouldn't look her in the eye. By Wednesday, a formal review of her teaching credentials had been initiated, citing complaints of erratic behavior. She saw Silas's hand in everything. He was isolating her, cutting the threads of her life one by one. She walked through the town square, and people who had known her since she was a child crossed the street to avoid her. The gossip mill, fueled by Mrs. Henderson's whispers at the post office, was working overtime. They said Maggie was having a breakdown. They said she was obsessed with old family secrets that didn't exist. The breaking point came on Friday. Maggie had gone to Silas's house, a sprawling modern estate that looked like a fortress of white stone, to try one last time to appeal to him. She found the gates open and walked in, the silence of the house unsettling. In the living room, she found her niece, Emily. The 12-year-old was sitting on a velvet sofa, her legs tucked under her, staring at a blank television screen. She looked small, her blonde hair pulled back in braids so tight they seemed to pull at her scalp. "Emily?" Maggie asked softly. The girl flinched, her shoulders jumping. She turned to Maggie, and the air left Maggie's lungs. Emily's sleeve was pushed up, and on the pale skin of her forearm were 3 distinct, crescent-shaped bruises. They were the marks of a hand gripping too hard. The same marks Maggie's mother had described in the journals. "Did your father do that?" Maggie whispered, stepping closer. Emily didn't answer. She pulled her sleeve down, her eyes darting to the hallway. "I was clumsy," she said, her voice a hollow imitation of a child's. "I fell. Emily, you can tell me. I can help." The girl looked at Maggie, and for a fleeting second, the terror in her eyes was naked. "No one can help," she whispered. "He's the judge now." A heavy footfall sounded in the hall. Silas appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the room like a poisonous gas. He looked at Maggie, then at his daughter. "Emily, go to your room," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but the girl vanished instantly, her sneakers silent on the marble floor. Silas walked toward Maggie, his face a calm, terrifying void. "I told you to stay away. You're hurting her, Silas, just like he hurt us." Silas laughed, a short, dry sound. "I am raising a daughter who understands respect, something you clearly never learned. Now get out before I call the sheriff and have you trespassed. And Maggie, the journals. Give them to me tonight, or Emily won't be the only one who learns a lesson about family loyalty." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, cold and absolute. Maggie backed away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She fled the house, the white stone walls feeling like the sides of a tomb. The following Sunday was the anniversary of their father's death. The town was holding a memorial dinner at the Civic Center, a grand affair meant to celebrate the Calloway legacy and kick off the final stretch of Silas's campaign. Maggie sat in her darkened kitchen, the journals on the table. A knock at the door made her jump. It was a courier, delivering a box. Inside was a dress of heavy black crepe, elegant and somber. A note from Silas was pinned to the fabric. "Wear this. Be at the dinner by 7. If you aren't there, and if the journals aren't in my hand by the end of the night, you will lose everything. This is your final warning." Maggie touched the fabric. It felt like a shroud. She looked at the journals, then at the bruises on her own arms where Silas had grabbed her. She thought of Emily, sitting in that silent house, learning how to be a victim. She didn't put on the dress. She put on her old, sensible wool coat. She took the journals and a small tape recorder she had used for her history lessons. She spent the next 3 hours in her basement, speaking into the recorder, her voice trembling but clear. When she arrived at the Civic Center, the parking lot was full of luxury cars. The windows of the building glowed with a warm, inviting light. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of expensive catering and the hum of 100 voices. Maggie entered through the side door, avoiding the reception line. She saw Silas at the head table, flanked by the governor and the chief of police. He looked magnificent, a king in his element. Emily sat next to him, her face a pale, frozen mask. Maggie moved toward the stage, her heart a drum in her ears. She felt the weight of the journals against her side. She saw Mrs. Henderson whispering to a group of women, their eyes darting toward her. She saw the sheriff, a man who had served under her father, nodding to Silas. She waited until Silas stood up to give the keynote address. The room fell silent, the respect for the Calloway name palpable. "My father believed in order," Silas began, his voice echoing through the hall. "He believed that a strong family is the foundation of a strong community." Maggie didn't wait. She walked onto the stage, her footsteps loud on the wooden planks. The crowd gasped, a low murmur rippling through the room. Silas stopped, his eyes turning to ice as he saw her. "Maggie," he said, his voice a warning hiss. "This isn't the time." "It's exactly the time, Silas." She reached into her bag and pulled out the journals. She didn't look at the crowd, she looked at Emily. "Our father wasn't a hero," Maggie said, her voice amplified by the microphone Silas was still holding. "He was a man who built a cage and called it a home. And Silas is building the same cage for his daughter." Silas moved to grab her, but Maggie stepped back, pulling the tape recorder from her pocket and pressing play. Her own voice, steady and haunting, began to read her mother's words. October 14th. "The bruises on my ribs have turned yellow. James says if I tell the doctor, he'll make sure I never see the children again. He says the law is whatever he says it is." The room went deathly silent. Silas lunged for the recorder, but Maggie threw the journals into the crowd. They landed on a table of reporters, the pages fluttering open. "Read them," Maggie screamed. "Read what he did." Silas grabbed her, his fingers digging into her throat, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "I'll kill you," he whispered, the words carrying through the live microphone. The crowd erupted. The sheriff moved forward, but he was too late. The reporters were already scanning the pages, their cameras flashing. The governor stood up, his face pale. But Maggie only looked at Emily. The girl had stood up, her eyes wide, watching her father crumble. For the first time, the mask on the child's face broke, and a single tear tracked through the powder on her cheek. The aftermath was a slow, painful dismantling of a dynasty. The journals were published, triggering a statewide investigation into the judge's past rulings and Silas's campaign finances. The Calloway legacy became a cautionary tale, a symbol of the rot that can hide behind a polished facade. Silas's career ended that night. He was indicted on several counts of witness intimidation and assault. He vanished from public life, retreating to a private facility to deal with his mental health. Though everyone knew it was a desperate attempt to avoid jail time, Maggie stayed in the old house. She didn't lose her job. Instead, the school board issued a public apology. She turned the first floor of the Calloway estate into a resource center for women and children, a place where silence was no longer a requirement for survival. A year later, Maggie sat on her porch, watching the sun set over the Appalachians. The mountains didn't look like bars anymore. They looked like ancient, silent witnesses who had finally been heard. Emily was sitting on the steps, a book in her lap. Her hair was loose, blowing in the evening breeze. She looked up and smiled, a real, tentative smile that reached her eyes. "Maggie?" she asked. "Can we go to the park tomorrow?" Maggie nodded, the tightness in her chest finally, fully gone. "Yes, Emily. We can go anywhere you want." She touched the wooden bracelet on her wrist, a gift from a mother who had died in silence so her daughter could finally speak. The truth hadn't been a light that burned. It had been a light that cleared the fog, revealing a path that had been there all along. Maggie Calloway breathed in the cool mountain air, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the echo.